Why have there been innumerable policing hours spent and budgets going into the dozens of millions? It's a nonsense. It's a nonsense. It's the Met Police, and why is the Met Police dealing with it? Surely this is Leicestershire Police, not Nottinghamshire. Surely this is Leicestershire's inquiry. And it actually it isn't even Leicestershire's inquiry. It's the police of the judicial police in Portugal. It's their jurisdiction. It's their inquiry, and they concluded early on, that there's nothing to see, and that the McCann should be held culpable. They've clearly stated it, and I totally concur with that. I think that's the truth.
You can pity the missing, or you can ask why they're missing. Only one of those brings you closer to truth. 17 years after Madeleine McCann vanished, the world still argues over who killed her. But the greater tragedy isn't just her death. It's the way compassion was turned into cover-up. I've seen victims forgotten so the system can survive, and I've watched killers turned into symbols. Today isn't about innocence or guilt. It's about the machinery that feeds on both. She was a child in a world designed by adults who mistook leisure for love and escape for responsibility. Every photograph of Madeleine McCann, the pink dress, the dimpled smile, the holiday sunlight frozen in time, became a symbol of innocence. But symbols are dangerous things. They make us feel rather than think. They let us mourn without changing anything. When I look at her picture, I don't see a mystery. I see vulnerability, the kind that every society pretends to protect while quietly exploiting. We've built what I call a hierarchy of vulnerability. At the top are the faces we can profit from, the photogenic, the white, the middle class, the ones that look good on front pages and in candlelight vigils. At the bottom are the forgotten, the kids from council flats, the refugees, the ones who disappear and are never even printed in black and white. Children are the most defenseless among us, yet they become a kind of currency. They're traded between politics, charity, and media like moral tokens. Look how much we care. The headlines scream, but care without accountability is just performance. The world grieved for Madeleine, but that grief came with sponsorship deals and documentary rights. I've worked hundreds of cases. I've seen the same pattern repeat. A child becomes famous only after they're gone. They become a safe tragedy, one that doesn't challenge us too much. People light candles, share hashtags, then move on to the next cycle of outrage. And somewhere, buried under all that sentiment, lies the quiet truth: a little girl was left alone, and the world was comfortable with that until it became inconvenient. In one of my investigations years ago, I met a boy who'd been rescued 3 times by the system. Every time his story hit the news, he'd get letters, toys, even funding campaigns in his name. But when the cameras left, he went back to the same abusive foster home. They loved him on television, but forgot him in the paperwork. That's what happens when compassion becomes a product. Madeleine's story isn't unique, it's amplified. Her disappearance exposed the fragility not only of one child, but of an entire civilization built on selective empathy. We choose which victims deserve our tears. The media tells us when to cry and when to scroll past. Governments use their faces to pass laws or polish reputations. It's a grim kind of alchemy, turning suffering into social capital. When I speak about the hierarchy of vulnerability, people often grow uncomfortable. They want to believe every child matters equally. But that's not how the world works. The public's heart bleeds only when it's safe to do so. It's easier to pity a girl from a holiday resort in Portugal than a child trafficked out of Birmingham or Bucharest. It's easier to cry for one poster than confront thousands of unreported files. I remember one case vividly. A young girl same age as Madeleine found dead in a flat. No headlines, no vigils, no politicians promising justice. Just silence. Her name crossed my desk in a case file marked non-suspicious death. I saw those eyes too wide, trusting, asking for something she would never get. When I looked into that file, I thought, these are the forgotten children, invisible because they don't fit the narrative. That's the cruelty of our system. We build institutions that claim to protect, yet operate like factories, sorting lives by publicity value. When a story like Madeleine's breaks, every office scrambles. Public relations teams craft statements. Charities launch appeals. Journalists write think pieces about the tragedy of modern parenting. Everyone gets to look righteous. Meanwhile, the real work, prevention, protection, reform, is left undone. I've seen the same hollow compassion in politicians shaking hands at memorials and in reporters chasing grieving parents through car parks. They call it empathy. I call it extraction. The more they show they care, the more they get votes, clicks, credibility. And through it all, the child remains an idea, not a person. It's hard to admit, but sometimes I think we love the story of Madeleine more than we loved Madeleine herself. Because the story made us feel human. It gave us a villain to hate, a mother to analyze, a mystery to solve. It turned tragedy into entertainment, grief into narrative. That's how modern empathy works. It's outsourced, franchised, and packaged for public consumption. When I first saw the McCann case file, I noticed something chilling. The public reaction was immediate, global, and deeply emotional, but the same energy that could have changed child protection policies was redirected into gossip, speculation, and scandal. The case became theater, not a warning. People sometimes ask me, why do you still care? Because I've seen those eyes before, the same mix of wonder and trust that doesn't belong in a case file. I've seen them in children who believed adults were safe, in kids who thought the police would come, in faces that never made the news. And every time I see a poster of Madeleine, I remember them too. There's a cruel symmetry to this: a child who vanishes becomes a saint of neglect. Her image comforts us, convinces us that we're still capable of compassion. We say her name like a prayer, but we don't change the world that lost her. That's the real tragedy, not that a child disappeared, but that she became proof of our moral laziness. When I talk about Madeleine, I don't speak as a journalist or an activist. I speak as a man who's walked through too many rooms where the laughter of children once echoed. And I've learned this: systems don't fail children by accident. They fail them because failure costs less than protection. The hierarchy of vulnerability ensures that some lives will always matter more than others, at least to the cameras. And until that changes, every missing child is just another story waiting to be recycled. So I'll leave you with a question I ask myself every time I see her face on the screen. Who is the real victim here, the child we lost, or the conscience we keep pretending we still have? When a child disappears, the world rushes to care. Cameras roll, charities appear, journalists descend like well-meaning vultures. Within days, the tragedy turns into an enterprise. And that is exactly what happened to Madeleine McCann. After her disappearance, her image stopped being a photograph and became a logo, a brand recognized across continents. Her name was printed on bracelets, banners, coffee cups, even airline posters. Every campaign carried her smile. Every broadcast repeated her story, and every repetition made someone, somewhere, some kind of profit. I remember saying once, when a child's face ends up on a coffee mug, justice has left the table. It wasn't cynicism, it was experience. I've seen this cycle too many times. The first few days after a disappearance, everyone means well. Then the money arrives, the attention multiplies, and the purity of grief begins to rot. Madeleine's tragedy was transformed into a marketplace of emotion. Television networks produced specials, newspapers printed front-page appeals, and online outlets competed for exclusive updates. New leads, fresh witnesses, sightings in Morocco, all became headlines engineered not to find her, but to maintain engagement. Every tearful broadcast extended the life of the story. Every sympathetic segment kept the public invested, emotionally and financially. Ron S. once called it media-manufactured empathy. He was right. It's not compassion anymore, it's an industry. Producers know how long an audience will care before they get bored. They study which angles of a child's face keep viewers watching longer. They test how many minutes of soft music and candlelight vigils can turn suffering into ratings. Even charity organizations learned to mimic that rhythm. A missing child became the perfect symbol for fundraising. No politics, no complexity, just a universally safe tragedy. And so, the campaigns began. Find Madeleine. We will never give up hope. The slogans were simple, powerful, and profitable. Within months, A fund was established, collecting donations from around the world. Corporations offered to sponsor posters. Celebrities posed with ribbons. Politicians wore badges on their suits. Somewhere along the way, grief turned into branding. In meetings I attended years later, people still referred to her case as the gold standard for public engagement. It sounds obscene, but in the world of media crisis management, that's a compliment. She became a case study on how to mobilize emotion globally. Consultants analyzed the campaign's reach. Marketing firms discussed its retention value. They weren't talking about a child anymore. They were talking about a product. Every tear was measured in views. Every prayer in ad revenue. Each candlelit vigil provided the perfect image: soft focus, trembling hands, the faint sound of sobbing. These moments were edited, repackaged, and monetized. And people felt good watching them, because it let them believe they were part of something moral. That's the illusion. The more we feel, the less we notice how our feelings are being managed. There's a kind of cruelty in that. True empathy demands silence, humility, and discomfort. But the empathy created by media is loud, photogenic, and marketable. It gives the appearance of action while ensuring that nothing really changes. When millions share a hashtag, no one asks why the system failed in the first place. Madeleine's story should have provoked outrage at negligence, questions about accountability, reforms in child protection. Instead, it became a cycle of sentimental updates and emotional performances. Each year brought new documentaries, anniversaries, podcasts, and never-before-seen footage. The world didn't want resolution, it wanted renewal. A permanent wound that could be reopened on demand. That's the exploitation no one wants to talk about. Because it's not committed by one person. It's collective. The public needs something to pity, the press needs something to sell, and governments need symbols of innocence to distract from institutional decay. The tragedy fits perfectly into that equation. I've met parents who lost children without a single camera pointed their way. Their grief was raw, private, unbearable, and honest. No PR teams, no official statements. Just silence and pain. But once a case enters the global spotlight, grief is no longer personal property. It becomes a public performance. The parents become actors in a script they didn't write. The world demands constant displays of sorrow, gratitude, and forgiveness. If they cry too little, they're cold. If they cry too much, they're dramatic. That's the curse of visibility. Once the cameras arrive, there is no right way to suffer. In the years following Madeleine's disappearance, I watched how that suffering was repackaged endlessly. Each new production, the mystery of Madeleine, the truth about the Algarve, unseen evidence, promised revelation but delivered repetition. The same images, the same quotes, the same tears. A ritual of remembrance that kept everyone talking but no one thinking. Behind every documentary and every news cycle lies a question. Who owns this pain now? Is it still the families? Or has it become public property, copyrighted, edited, broadcast, and sold back to the people who once felt it? When I investigate cases like this, I often feel trapped between two worlds, the one where a little girl is gone, and the one where her absence fuels a billion-dollar industry of empathy. And in that second world, every time someone says her name, they aren't necessarily remembering her, they're renewing the contract. What's left of Madeleine McCann is not only a tragedy, but an infrastructure, a network of media, charities, and public relations experts who thrive on the constant recycling of her story. Even now, years later, new podcasts, true crime exposés, and dramatizations resurrect her image, because the market demands it. The mystery is too valuable to solve. That's what I meant when I said she became a victim twice. The first time was the night she vanished. The second was every time her name was used to sell the illusion of caring. We like to tell ourselves that empathy makes us human. But empathy, when industrialized, becomes manipulation. It lets society appear moral while staying indifferent. Madeleine became both a child and a commodity, a symbol of innocence and a shield against accountability. And as long as her face remains a brand, justice will always remain a slogan. In every high-profile case, there comes a moment when the public demands a villain. They want a name, a face, and preferably a photo that looks guilty. They don't want complexity, They want closure. And when the truth refuses to cooperate, the system provides a substitute. That's what I call suspect substitution. It's the point when an investigation stops being about evidence and starts being about reassurance. I've seen it more times than I can count. The crime remains unsolved. The outrage grows, the politicians panic, and the press begins to turn restless. Someone has to be fed to the fire. In 2020, 13 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, the world was handed a new suspect, Christian Bruckner. His face spread across headlines like a virus: the mugshot, the glare, the untidy hair, the perfect villain. Germany called him a dangerous predator, and within hours, the story was global again. The old wounds reopened, and for a brief moment, everyone believed the mystery was finally over. But when you strip away the drama, what remains? A man with a criminal record, a connection to the Algarve, and a history of violent and offenses. Enough to justify suspicion, but not enough to justify certainty. Bruckner had lived on the fringes of the Portuguese resort town, drifting between substance use, petty theft, and the underground of European crime. He owned a van, an old yellow VW, and people remembered seeing him around. That's all it took. In the public imagination, the outline filled itself in. He had motive, means, and mystery. It didn't matter that the timeline was loose, or that no physical evidence tied him to the apartment. The narrative was too convenient to question. Ron S. said it best during our conversation: Bruckner might be a criminal, Jon, but not this criminal. And I agreed. Because every detail about his life was the kind of noise investigators love to amplify when they need a quick answer. I've worked those cases before, the ones that start with chaos and end with compromise. The police need results. The public needs peace. And the easiest way to get both is to take a familiar face, one already marked by guilt, and place it inside the unsolved story. You don't have to prove he did it. You just have to make people believe he could have. Bruckner was a dream come true for that strategy. He was German, transient, already convicted of child mistreatment and forced sexual act. His record spoke louder than any forensic report could. He fit the archetype so well that the media didn't need to invent anything. They simply rearranged the facts until they formed the outline of a monster. Headlines described him as lunner, a drifter, a predator. The photographs used were always the worst ones: sunken eyes, crooked teeth, half shadows. It wasn't journalism, it was stagecraft. I've seen this before: the deliberate framing, the subtle coloring, the psychological shorthand. A few edits and a good caption can turn any troubled man into the embodiment of evil. The trick works because it comforts people. It restores moral order. If the world can label one man as the monster, then everyone else can breathe easier. The story becomes digestible again. Evil has a face, and it's not ours. But when I started looking at the details, the foundation cracked almost immediately. There was no DNA, no confirmed sighting, no witness placing him inside the McCann apartment. The evidence presented by the German prosecutors was circumstantial at best, a string of coincidences linked together by ambition. And yet, the declaration was made publicly: we have evidence that Madeleine is dead and that Christian Bruckner is responsible. No body, no proof, but total certainty. That's not investigation, that's theater. I remember sitting with Ron, watching one of those televised briefings. He turned to me and said, "They're not talking to the courts, Jon. They're talking to the crowd." He was right. It wasn't about building a case. It was about managing perception. The media ran with it like it was gospel. They replayed the same 5 photographs, ran timelines that made sense only in headlines, and quoted unnamed sources from German intelligence. It was the perfect storm, a mix of fear, hope, and fatigue. People wanted the story to end, and Bruckner gave them a way to pretend it had. That's what suspect substitution does. It trades uncertainty for narrative satisfaction. It silences doubt by feeding the public's appetite for simplicity. The truth becomes optional. I can't count how many times I've seen this pattern play out. In the early 2000s, there was a similar case involving a murdered teenager in London. The first suspect fit the stereotype: poor, angry, foreign. The tabloids plastered his name everywhere. Within months, the real killer, a man with political connections, was quietly acquitted. The story died, the wrong man carried the stigma, and the system survived intact. It's always the same equation. When justice threatens power, power manufactures guilt. In the McCann case, the timing of Bruckner's emergence was too convenient to ignore. Operation Grange in the UK was losing funding. Public interest was fading. Questions about the parents were resurfacing. The Portuguese authorities were frustrated, and the case had become politically toxic. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Germany announced they had their man. It reset the narrative. It gave everyone a new direction, a safe one. The British government could redirect attention. The German police could claim progress. The Portuguese could step back quietly. Everyone won, except the truth. I've read through the documents released by the prosecutors. The so-called evidence includes vague witness statements, a confession from an unreliable inmate, and a general pattern of criminal behavior. None of it places Bruckner within a mile of Madeleine on the night she disappeared. But that's not the point. The point was to show action, to close the emotional wound. That's the cruelty of suspect substitution. Once a scapegoat is chosen, the pursuit of truth stops mattering. And what's worse, the public rarely wants to hear that. Once they've been given a villain, any challenge to that image feels like betrayal. If you suggest the system might be lying, they call you a conspiracist. If you question the evidence, they call you heartless. The illusion must be maintained. Ron and I have both been in this business long enough to recognize the smell of controlled narratives. You can hear it in the language. A likely suspect. Trusted sources. Official confirmation. None of those phrases mean anything legally, but they sound comforting. They sound final. Christian Bruckner became the face of closure. A way for the world to sleep again. But real justice isn't about sleep. It's about discomfort. It's about following the evidence even when it leads somewhere unpopular. I'm not defending Bruckner. He's done terrible things. But guilt in one life doesn't grant guilt in another. You can be a criminal and still be innocent of a particular crime. The moment we forget that, we trade justice for convenience. That's what happened here. The investigation turned into a performance. The audience applauded, the authorities bowed, and the curtain fell, all while the truth remained somewhere backstage, unseen and unfound. So whenever I hear people say, "At least we know who did it," I have to bite my tongue. Because what they really mean is, at least we can stop thinking about it. That's the danger of suspect substitution. It satisfies the crowd but starves the conscience. And in the end, that's how the system survives. When truth becomes inconvenient, they don't find the killer, they create one. Every investigation begins with the same promise: we will find the truth. But somewhere along the way, that promise turns into a performance. In the Madeleine McCann case, the real crime wasn't the abduction of a child. It was what happened after, the quiet, methodical distortion of justice. When people think of murder, they imagine violence, blood, and intent. But there's another kind of killing, slower, quieter, far more civilized. It's the murder of truth. I've seen it happen in boardrooms and briefings, in press statements and parliamentary hearings. It doesn't leave a body. It leaves a legacy of confusion. The McCann case became a blueprint for that kind of institutional killing. It stopped being a police inquiry and became a political negotiation. Every nation involved, Germany, Britain, Portugal, built its own version of the truth, shaped by diplomacy, reputation, and self-preservation. Facts became bargaining chips. Jurisdiction became a shield. I call it the system of three walls. The legal wall came first. After 2007, the case fractured along national lines. The Portuguese PJ held the original jurisdiction, but soon the British Metropolitan Police launched Operation Grange, claiming they could bring fresh perspective. Then, in 2020, the German authorities declared they had new evidence and a prime suspect. 3 countries, 3 investigations, none truly cooperating. On paper, it looked like international partnership. In reality, it was territorial control. Each agency guarded its files like state secrets. Requests for evidence were delayed or denied. Mutual legal assistance treaties became tools of obstruction rather than cooperation. The Germans said they couldn't share because of ongoing prosecution. The British said their hands were tied by data protection. The Portuguese shrugged and blamed foreign interference. Inside those silos, truth suffocated. I spoke to an officer in Lisbon who told me every request from London had to be translated twice, once in language, once in intention. What he meant was clear: the British didn't want answers. They wanted ownership. The Germans weren't seeking justice, they were seeking closure. And the Portuguese, they just wanted it all to go away. That's the first wall: bureaucracy disguised as procedure. Justice trapped behind forms, signatures, and jurisdictional pride. Then came the media wall. From the very beginning, the story of Madeleine McCann was too valuable to leave in the hands of investigators. It belonged to broadcasters, tabloids, and public relations firms. Every development was rewritten, rephrased, and repackaged until it fit the emotional rhythm of the news cycle. Hope on Monday, outrage by Friday, reflection by Sunday. When the Germans announced their breakthrough in 2020, I watched the same script unfold. The headlines didn't ask if Christian Bruckner was guilty. They asked how soon he would be convicted. The narrative had already been standardized: a dangerous loner, a tragic child, a determined police force. It didn't matter that the evidence was circumstantial, or that the investigation was fragmented across 3 countries. The media had a formula, and formulas sell better than facts. Behind the cameras, the relationship between law enforcement and journalists grew symbiotic. The police needed publicity to secure funding. The media needed exclusives to secure clicks. Each fed the other while starving the truth. I've seen officers leak details for attention, and reporters trade sympathy for access. They justify it as public interest, but what they really mean is audience engagement. That's how the media wall works. It replaces inquiry with narrative. It gives people something to believe, not something to understand. And once a story becomes global, it stops belonging to reality and starts belonging to emotion. The third, and perhaps the most dangerous, is the moral wall. This one isn't built by governments or editors. It's built by society itself. It's the invisible barrier of fear of being hated, misunderstood, or accused of cruelty. In the McCann case, that wall appeared the moment anyone suggested the unthinkable, that the family might have played some part, however accidental, in their daughter's disappearance. I remember the first time a Portuguese detective voiced that suspicion publicly. He was torn apart in the press, labeled heartless and obsessed. Books were banned, careers destroyed, reputations shredded. The public didn't want to consider that possibility, not because the evidence ruled it out, but because the idea was unbearable. That's how moral cowardice disguises itself as compassion. We tell ourselves we're protecting the innocent, when in truth, we're protecting our own comfort. We'd rather condemn a stranger than confront a parent. We'd rather preserve an image of purity than explore a possibility that might make us flinch. The result is paralysis. Investigators censor themselves. Journalists self-edit. The public retreats into silence. The truth doesn't die in interrogation rooms or courtrooms. It dies in living rooms when ordinary people decide that not knowing is easier than knowing. I've seen this pattern before. In other child mistreatment cases, the same moral wall kept people quiet for decades. Teachers, priests, social workers all convinced they were doing the right thing by saying nothing. They called it compassion. I call it cowardice. The McCann investigation was never just about one child. It became a mirror reflecting how the modern world deals with guilt. Each country, each institution, each person built a version of the story that made them feel less responsible. Germany pointed to the monster abroad. Britain pointed to the inefficiency of Portugal. Portugal pointed to foreign interference. And the rest of us pointed to the TV, convinced that watching was the same as caring. That's how collective cowardice operates, not through conspiracy, but through convenience. Everyone does a little less than they should. Everyone avoids the question that hurts. And slowly, justice becomes theater, empathy becomes paralysis, and truth becomes taboo. When I talk to younger officers about this case, I tell them, the real crime isn't what happened that night. The real crime is what happened every night after, when people with power decided to protect themselves instead of the truth. I remember standing outside the police headquarters in Lisbon one evening. The building was lit from within, every window glowing gold. Inside, Files sat in drawers. Reports lay untranslated, and statements gathered dust. Outside, reporters waited for a quote, tourists took photos, and life went on. It struck me then justice doesn't fail in the dark. It fails in the light, right in front of everyone, when no one dares to look too closely. We built 3 walls around Madeleine's case. One of law, one of story, one of morality. And behind those walls, the truth still waits small, fragile, and uninvited. People often ask me why this case still matters. The answer is simply because if a story like this can be buried beneath politics, media, and fear, then any story can. And if a child's disappearance can be turned into a spectacle, then no child is truly safe from becoming a commodity of comfort. In the end, justice isn't murdered by corruption alone. It's strangled by hesitation, by good people afraid to be unpopular. Truth doesn't die in interrogation rooms. It dies in silence. And silence, I've learned, is never neutral. It's a choice. So if you want to know who killed justice in this case, don't look at one man. Look at the system that stood around the truth and politely looked away. Because the real crime isn't conspiracy, or incompetence, or even deceit. The real crime is collective cowardice. In every tragedy, there comes a moment when grief stops being private. It begins to speak the language of cameras, a language I've learned to distrust. In the case of Madeleine McCann, that moment came early. Within days, the family's sorrow became a public event, their faces turned into recurring characters in a global drama. And like any drama, it needed direction, structure, and audience engagement. I want to be clear, I don't accuse, I observe, because I've seen real grief, and it doesn't have a script. When you've worked in child protection long enough, you learn the difference. Real grief is messy, silent, unpredictable. It doesn't repeat lines for press conferences. It doesn't rehearse. It shakes the body, not the headlines. But what the world saw in Praia da Luz was a grief that had been transformed not by deceit, but by exposure. It was forced to perform, shaped by the demands of cameras and the choreography of public sympathy. In those early days, every photograph of the McCanns was analyzed, every gesture dissected. The parents were trapped between expectation and judgment. If they smiled, they were cold. If they cried, they were manipulative. The world wanted emotion, but not too much of it. And under that scrutiny, even sincerity starts to look suspicious. That's the curse of public tragedy. You can't just mourn. You must manage your mourning. What unfolded was what I call grief management. It's the process by which genuine emotion is packaged, polished, and distributed to keep a public narrative alive. The media doesn't just report on grief, it produces it, edits it, and decides when to replay it. In the McCann case, the family became a brand of pain, and that brand needed consistency. Press officers advised tone and posture. Statements were timed. Interviews approved, lighting adjusted. There were guidelines on when to speak and when to stay silent, what color to wear, which photographs to release. What began as desperation to find a child turned into a machine of perception control. And the public, unknowingly, played its part. Half the world chose to sympathize. They sent donations, letters, prayers. They shared photos, they cried during interviews, they felt connected to the family's suffering. The other half chose suspicion. They scrutinized the parents, dissected their body language, analyzed every word for deceit. And yet, both sides, the compassionate and the cynical, served the same function. They kept the story alive. Because that's what the media needs. Perpetual engagement. Outrage and empathy are just two sides of the same coin. Both keep the spotlight burning. Both generate revenue, attention, and power. I remember once sitting in a newsroom during another missing child case. A producer said quietly, "Sympathy sells, but doubt sells longer." It was the most honest thing I'd heard that day. Compassion exhausts itself, suspicion renews itself. And the McCann case became the perfect cycle, comfort followed by controversy, empathy followed by accusation. The narrative never had to end, it just had to alternate. That's why I say their grief was performed, not by choice, but by necessity. Once the cameras arrived, it was no longer theirs. Imagine waking up every day knowing that your pain is public property. That your facial expressions are being rated like performances. That your every word will be interpreted through the lens of guilt or virtue. In that environment, even honesty becomes strategic. You start asking yourself, how will this look? Before you even speak. That's not deceit. That's survival. And yet, the more you perform grief, the less real it becomes to others. The tragedy that once united people starts dividing them. Some accuse the family of being too controlled. Others defend them with religious zeal. The investigation becomes secondary, the emotion becomes the main event. That's the danger of grief management. It soothes the crowd but silences the truth. In Portugal, police officers were frustrated that the media attention turned their case into theater. Investigative leads were replaced by press briefings. Every announcement was filtered through PR specialists before it reached the detectives. Real police work slow, methodical, quiet couldn't compete with the hunger for spectacle. The audience must be comforted, one official reportedly said. But comfort and justice rarely coexist. This is what happens when society can't bear uncertainty. Instead of demanding facts, it demands feelings. Instead of proof, it accepts performance. The collective pain is anesthetized by the image of a grieving family on television, the illusion of progress. People say, "At least we're doing something," as if empathy itself could solve a crime. I've seen this pattern before. In many high-profile tragedies, the families are transformed into moral archetypes. They stop being people and start being stories. Every action is weighed for symbolism. Every silence becomes evidence. They are forced to carry not only their loss, but the expectations of millions. In one case I worked years ago, a mother whose daughter had been murdered became a media sensation. She was praised for her strength, interviewed endlessly, photographed endlessly. But behind the scenes, she told me, "I haven't cried properly in months. I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore." The world had turned her grief into a job. That's the part no one sees, the exhaustion of being everyone's tragedy. The McCanns lived that exhaustion for years. Whether innocent or guilty of anything, they were devoured by the machinery of empathy. Their faces became shorthand for hope and horror. Every anniversary brought new interviews, new documentaries, new speculations. The story no longer belonged to them, it belonged to the ecosystem that fed on it. Even now, you can still see how that ecosystem operates. The anniversaries are branded events. The headlines return on schedule, 17 years on. A family still waiting. New leads emerge. None of it ever truly changes, but all of it keeps the grief alive just enough to sell one more cycle of attention. And we, the public, play our role again. We click, we comment, we choose sides. Half pity, half suspicion. Never resolution. Because if the story ended, the empathy industry would lose its supply. That's why I say this case was never just about Madeleine. It became about us, about what kind of comfort we demand from tragedy. The media turned mourning into a ritual, and we kept attending the service, year after year, mistaking participation for purpose. The story of a vanished child turned into an emotional theater that required no ending, no answers. It only required maintenance. There's something profoundly disturbing about that. In this tragedy, even compassion was choreographed. We learned how to feel on cue, when to cry, when to suspect, when to hope. The family became symbols, the audience became consumers, and grief, once sacred, became a stage performance with global distribution rights. When I look back on it now, I don't see villains and heroes. I see a system that took genuine human pain and turned it into a currency. And in that transaction, everyone lost something. The family lost privacy, the police lost focus, and the world lost the ability to feel without being told how. So, when people ask me what I think of the McCanns, I say this: I think they were swallowed by the same machine that claimed their daughter. And perhaps that's the cruelest twist of all, that in a story built on loss, even empathy wasn't real. Because in this tragedy, even compassion was directed. When you realize the killer isn't the only one responsible. The evidence may belong to the police, but the story belongs to the public. We write it together with our fears, our fascination, and our need for closure. And as I've said before, we need to believe in the villain so that we don't have to look at ourselves. Because the hardest truth to face is this: the public keeps the machine alive. When Madeleine McCann vanished, the entire world became her jury. Millions of people glued to screens, scrolling, judging, dissecting. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had a theory. We weren't looking for justice, we were looking for relief from the discomfort of helplessness. We needed someone to blame so we could feel safe again. That's the psychology of the crowd, the ancient, primal instinct that says, if there's a monster out there, it can't be in here. I've watched that instinct drive every high-profile case of my career. It starts with genuine compassion. People want to help, to share, to feel connected. But compassion is fragile. When it meets confusion or contradiction, it mutates into something else: the obsession, speculation, and eventually, entertainment. We are addicted to tragedy. It gives us something to feel without requiring us to act. And the media, ever observant, feeds that addiction like a dealer who knows his market too well. Every new headline, every breaking update, is a small dose of catharsis. We consume suffering in episodes, binge watch it, discuss it, rank it. The missing child becomes content. The accused becomes a character. The investigation becomes a series. And justice, that quiet, complicated pursuit, is replaced by audience engagement metrics. I've said it many times, we've turned justice into entertainment. It sounds harsh, but look around. The lighting, the music, the slow-motion footage of investigators walking into buildings. Even grief has a production budget now. The true crime genre didn't invent this. It simply inherited what society had already normalized: a fascination with pain that costs us nothing but attention. And that attention is powerful. The system knows it. The media manipulates it. Politicians exploit it. Because a distracted public is easy to control. That's where moral outsourcing begins. It's what happens when people hand over their conscience to institutions, to the press, to the courts, to the talking heads on television. Instead of thinking critically, we consume pre-packaged morality. We let news anchors tell us who deserves empathy and who deserves punishment. We let documentaries decide what's tragic and what's suspicious. Moral outsourcing makes us feel righteous without responsibility. I've seen it firsthand. When a scandal breaks, people rush to align themselves with the good side. They share posts, light virtual candles, and denounce villains from the comfort of their living rooms. They call it awareness. But awareness without action is just self-congratulation. When the Madeleine case resurfaced with the Christian Bruckner narrative, I watched moral outsourcing in real time. The headlines told us who to hate, and we obeyed. The same journalists who once protected the McCanns now tore into Bruckner with theatrical disgust. No one asked for proof. They didn't need it. The story offered something far more satisfying than facts: a moral shortcut. It's easier to condemn than to question. Easier to trust the narrative than to demand transparency. Because questioning takes courage, and courage risks isolation. I think about this often. How society's fear of standing alone has become its greatest weakness. In every major injustice I've investigated: child exploitation rings, institutional cover-ups, cases that involved the rich or powerful, there were always people who knew something was wrong. But they stayed silent because silence is safer. They told themselves, someone else will speak. That's how corruption thrives, not through evil, but through apathy. We, the public, like to think we are powerless, but we are not. Our attention is currency. Our outrage is energy. Every time we choose sensationalism over substance, we fund the system that betrays us. I once met a detective who worked on the McCann investigation. He said something that stayed with me. We stopped investigating when the cameras started filming. At first, I thought he was exaggerating. But the more I looked, the more I understood. Publicity changes priorities. The investigation shifts from truth to optics. You stop asking what happened and start asking what people want to hear. And what do people want to hear? They want neat endings, righteous villains, and heroes who make them feel good about the world again. They don't want the messy truth that justice is slow, flawed, and sometimes unbearable. That's why, in case after case, we recycle the same script: the innocent victim, the evil suspect, the tearful confession, the closing shot of peace restored. It's not reality. It's a performance of morality, repeated until it feels real. We have become spectators in our own moral theater, and the most tragic part, the victims become secondary. Their stories end up buried under our need to feel something. The McCann case should have been a wake-up call, a reminder that systems can fail, even the most privileged families, that negligence and media manipulation can coexist. Instead, it became another season in our endless binge of tragedy. I sometimes wonder what would happen if we turned the cameras around, if the lens that scrutinizes suspects and parents suddenly focused on the audience. What would it reveal? Millions of people trading empathy for entertainment, billions of clicks feeding a machine that thrives on the pain of others. A civilization that can't stop watching long enough to fix what it sees. That's the uncomfortable truth. We don't just consume tragedy, we sustain it. We tell ourselves that watching is caring, that sharing awareness is action, that outrage is progress. But none of that brings justice. Justice requires discomfort. It demands that we face the systems and the selves that enable these stories to repeat. I've worked cases where the public pressure saved lives. But I've also seen cases destroyed by the same pressure. Leaks, rumors, false leads, all generated to feed attention rather than truth. The crowd that prays for justice today becomes the mob that shouts for blood tomorrow. And somewhere in that noise, the real evidence gets lost. We've mistaken participation for purpose. We no longer ask, what's true? We ask, what feels right? That's the language of moral outsourcing morality as a consumer choice. When I speak at conferences, I sometimes ask a simple question. If a child went missing tomorrow, what would you do differently? People say they donate, post, organize vigils. And I tell them, that's the problem. You've already decided what to feel, not what to do. The truth is, most people don't want justice. They want resolution. They want to stop thinking about it. To close the tab, turn off the screen, and believe the world makes sense again. That desire, that hunger for comfort, is what keeps this entire cycle spinning. Until we face that, nothing will change. Because every time a child disappears, the same story will replay the same public hysteria, the same media manipulation, the same substitution of feeling for fact. We'll mourn, debate, speculate, and move on. And somewhere out there, another child will vanish into the silence we left behind. So I say this not as an investigator, but as a witness to human nature. If the public doesn't change, if we don't reclaim our conscience from the headlines, the next case will look exactly the same. Different name, different face, same script, same ending. In every police force, there's a line you're not supposed to cross. It's invisible, unspoken, but every officer feels it. You learn quickly that your duty is not just to the truth, it's to the hierarchy, the reputation, the chain of command. And once you challenge that chain, you're on your own. When I think about the Madeleine McCann case, I don't just think of the child or the family. I think of the investigators, men and women in Portugal and Germany who began by following the evidence and ended up being punished for it. A detective from the PJ told me once, over a quiet drink in Lisbon, the moment we asked the wrong questions, the case stopped being ours. He wasn't exaggerating. Some of those officers were removed from their posts, others reassigned to meaningless duties, a few simply retired early. Their sin was curiosity. They had started to dig in directions that made the powerful uncomfortable. It wasn't just Portugal. In Germany, the prosecutor leading the Christian Bruckner inquiry was told not to hold any more press briefings after making statements that couldn't be proven in court. Internally, he was praised for progress. Publicly, he was silenced for overstepping. Different country, same messages: don't embarrass the system. Every officer knows the cost of crossing that line. When I joined the Metropolitan Police, I was full of idealism. I believed in service, in accountability, in justice. But over the years, I learned an unwritten rule: there are truths you can pursue, and truths you must leave alone. Step beyond that boundary, and you're not protecting the badge anymore, you're threatening it. I've been there myself. I've sat in rooms where superiors told me to drop it, to let sleeping dogs lie. I've watched cases disappear because they reached too close to people with influence. And when I refused to let go, they came for me. They froze me out, questioned my mental health, spread rumors. That's the tactic: isolate, discredit, remove. Not because you're wrong, but because you're inconvenient. So when I see those Portuguese detectives stripped of authority for asking questions, I understand them. I understand the loneliness that comes after you've been told you're no longer one of us. Being a whistleblower isn't a choice. It's a consequence. It happens when your conscience grows louder than your fear. And in law enforcement, that's a dangerous thing. Most people think corruption is about envelopes of cash, about favors exchanged in parking lots. But real corruption is quieter. It's the culture of silence, the institutional reflex to protect itself first and truth second. It's not that the police are evil. Far from it. Most of the officers I've worked with are good men and women. But good people inside a bad system can do terrible things when they're afraid. Fear is the currency of control. It keeps files closed, questions unasked, voices low. You don't need to tell an officer not to investigate a certain lead. You just need to show them what happened to the last one who did. In Portugal, the lead investigator Goncalo Amaral was removed after suggesting that inconsistencies in the parents' statements should be re-examined. He was vilified by the press, sued, humiliated, and left to rebuild his life under a cloud of suspicion. His career became the cautionary tale whispered in offices. Don't be another Amaral. In Germany, several detectives who challenged the Bruckner theory, who quietly questioned the absence of evidence, found themselves reassigned or ignored. No formal reprimands, no headlines, just professional disappearance. That's how modern censorship works. It doesn't need shackles, it just needs bureaucracy. When I started speaking publicly about institutional child mistreatment in Britain, the same thing happened. They called me disgruntled, obsessed, unstable. They hoped people would question my credibility rather than my claims. It's an old trick: if you can't kill the evidence, kill the messenger. And yet, despite the fear, there's always a few who can't let it go. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's faith. But they keep pushing, even when it costs them everything. Those are the real cops, not the ones who climb ranks, but the ones who refuse to climb over the truth. I've met officers who broke down, crying years later, haunted not by what they did, but by what they didn't do. One told me, "Every night I tell myself I was just following orders. But deep down, I know I was following fear." That's the quiet torment of conscience. It doesn't shout, it whispers, every single day. We talk a lot about whistleblowers as if they're rebels, but most of them are reluctant heroes. They don't want attention or applause. They want to sleep at night. They speak up because silence has become unbearable. And when they do, the institutions they serve turn on them with surgical precision. I used to believe that loyalty meant obedience. Now I know it means honesty, even when honesty hurts. A real institution should be strong enough to survive the truth. When it isn't, it collapses inward, devouring its own integrity piece by piece. That's what I see in the McCann case: institutions protecting themselves at the expense of their own people. Detectives punished not for lying, but for asking. Prosecutors told to stop clarifying. Governments shielding reputations instead of realities. And underneath it all, a silent fraternity of officers who know too much and say too little. People ask me, why didn't they fight back? But fighting back is a luxury. When you've got a mortgage, a family, a pension, you measure your courage in whispers, not in headlines. Every officer knows that one wrong sentence can end decades of service. So they convince themselves they're doing the right thing by staying quiet, that protecting the institution is the same as protecting the public. It isn't. Institutions don't bleed when they're wrong. People do. Children do. Truth does. That's the paradox of policing. We're trained to confront danger, yet we're terrified of confronting our own bosses. We're taught to protect the innocent, yet we're punished for protecting the inconvenient. The badge is supposed to represent courage, but the system teaches fear. I sometimes tell young recruits, don't let the job make you forget why you joined. But it's easy to say, harder to live, because the higher you climb, the more you see, and the more you realize how fragile your position is. When the Portuguese detectives were sidelined, when the German investigators were silenced, the message rippled through every department involved. Don't ask questions that cost careers. And that message worked. The files remain closed. The leads remain untested. The truth remains buried not because no one knows it, but because no one dares to say it out loud. I don't believe the police are broken. I believe they're bound. Bound by fear, by politics, by the illusion of unity. The system doesn't need to corrupt every cop. It just needs to convince them that doing the right thing will destroy them. That's how silence wins. Because the police aren't rotten. The system just taught them to be afraid of doing what's right. Justice doesn't begin with accusation. It begins with courage, the courage to look directly at the truth, even when it's ugly, even when it hurts. That's what I've learned after years of chasing ghosts through case files and cold rooms. The names change, the countries change, but the pattern remains the same. A child disappears, a story takes shape, and somewhere along the way, the truth becomes inconvenient. Then the system buries it not with lies, but with comfort. Comfort is the enemy of justice. People think justice is about punishment, about who goes to prison and who walks free. But real justice is moral. It's the willingness to confront what everyone else avoids, the silences, the contradictions, the uncomfortable possibilities. The Madeleine McCann case is not just a tragedy, it's a mirror. And what it shows us is a society terrified of facing itself. For 17 years, the world has chosen comfort over clarity. We built theories, sold documentaries, made villains and saints, but rarely asked the one question that matters: what if the truth isn't the story we want? That question takes courage, and courage is in short supply. When I speak about this case, I'm not asking anyone to take sides. I'm asking them to step outside the noise, to strip away the headlines, the sympathy, the outrage, all the layers that make it easy to feel and hard to think. Because empathy without understanding is just anesthesia. It numbs, but it doesn't heal. I've seen what happens when people confuse compassion with compliance. They stop asking questions. They defend institutions that don't deserve defending. They call skepticism cruelty and conformity virtue. That's how injustice survives, not through conspiracy, but through politeness. I'm not here to accuse. Accusations are easy. What's hard is honesty, the kind that doesn't care whose reputation it threatens. If we want to honor Madeleine, we can't do it by protecting myths. We can only do it by demanding evidence. Evidence that can be tested, not broadcast. Evidence that can stand in court, not just in the court of opinion. Because justice isn't found in trending hashtags or memorial vigils. It's found in the unglamorous work of verification. So I say this to everyone watching: separate your empathy from your entertainment. If the media shows you grief, ask what they're selling with it. If an authority tells you the case is solved, ask to see the proof. If someone who once worked inside the system risks everything to tell you otherwise, don't dismiss them, protect them. Whistleblowers aren't rebels, they're witnesses of conscience. And every time one of them is silenced, truth loses a little more air. I know what that silence feels like. It's heavy. It follows you home. You start questioning yourself, your memory, your sanity, your purpose. But truth doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It waits. It burns quietly, like a candle behind a curtain, until one day the fabric catches fire. That's what I hope happens here. Not more outrage, not another documentary, but ignition. A small flame of awareness that spreads. One person deciding to ask the question everyone else avoided. One journalist refusing to print what doesn't add up. One detective who reads the old file and says, "Let's test it again." That's how justice begins, with one act of defiance against the comfort of ignorance. In one of my interviews, I said that truth can't be destroyed. It can only be covered, like a candle hidden under a hand. The flame doesn't die, it just flickers, waiting for someone brave enough to remove the shadow. That's where we are now. The light is still there. It always was. I've spent a lifetime watching institutions collapse under the weight of their own lies. But I've also seen people, ordinary people, hold the line. They're the ones who keep asking, keep digging, keep refusing to let go. They're not heroes. They're human beings who decided that silence was no longer bearable. If you take anything from this, let it be this: justice is not a gift handed down by the powerful. It's a responsibility claimed by the aware. Every case like this repeats because we let it. We look, we cry, we move on. And in doing so, we teach the next system that it can get away with it again. If we want to break that cycle, we must do what the system won't: confront the discomfort head-on. So don't just pity the child who disappeared. Pity the society that made her vanish twice, once in body and again in truth. When I close my eyes, I picture that small candle. The room is dark, the air is heavy, and all around it are hands trying to hide the light. Hands of officials, journalists, politicians, and even the public, afraid of what the illumination might reveal. But no hand can hold back light forever. The moment someone moves, even slightly, the flame escapes. That's the truth. You can't kill it. You can only delay its arrival. And maybe that's the lesson this case leaves behind: not a solved mystery, but a moral demand. To care less about comfort and more about consequence. To value truth over reputation. To realize that silence is not compassion, it's complicity. I've often been asked, do you think justice will ever come for her? And I always answer the same way: only when truth becomes louder than comfort. Until that day, she remains missing, not just in body, but in meaning. And when the candle burns low, I remind myself no one can extinguish the light of truth. They can only cover it with their hands. But hands grow tired, shadows shift, and truth, patient as ever, waits to be seen.